Close your eyes for just a moment. Imagine a single man. See him not as a figure in a painting or a name in a history book, but as a force of nature, a whirlwind of ambition that tore across a continent, forever changing the world in its wake. This one man redrew the map of Europe, gave civilization a new code of laws, and built an empire that rivaled the legacy of Rome. And yet, this same man led 500,000 soldiers to their doom in the Russian snows, bled his nation dry for the sake of his own glory, and left behind a human cost measured in the millions. How can these two figures be the same person? The visionary architect and the reckless destroyer, the genius and the gambler. The answer does not lie in the chronicles of his battles. It lies hidden deeper, within the architecture of his own mind. This is not a story of what Napoleon did. This is a journey into why he did it. An autopsy of an empire, by way of the autopsy of his emperor's mind. Prepare to look beyond the legend and into the shadow. The story begins now. History does not remember Napoleon Bonaparte as a boy. It remembers the general, the first consul, the emperor. It recalls the figure astride a rearing stallion in Jacques-Louis David's grand propaganda, a man seemingly born of marble and destiny. But to ignore the boy is to miss the entire point, to misunderstand the psychological engine that powered the man. One must first walk the chilly corridors of the military academy at Brienne-le-Château and feel the sting of ostracism through the eyes of a brooding, undersized Corsican boy, a foreigner in his own country. Napoleon, born Napoleone di Bonaparte, was not truly French. He was a product of the rugged, clannish island of Corsica, annexed by France just a year before his birth. His native tongue was Corsican, an Italian dialect, and when he was sent to military school in mainland France at the age of 9, his French was clumsy, his accent thick, his name a source of ridicule. He was short, serious, and possessed an intensity that his aristocratic, privileged classmates found alien. They mocked him as la paille au nez, straw in the nose, for his strange pronunciation of his own name. In this crucible of youthful cruelty, the core of Napoleon's psychology was forged. He was an outsider, defined by what he was not. And from that position of perceived inferiority grew a desire, a need, a ferocious, all-consuming ambition, not merely to join the French elite, but to dominate them. This was the birth of the Corsican's complex, a deep-seated insecurity masked by a veneer of arrogant superiority and a relentless drive to prove his worth on a scale the world had never seen. This complex was the fuel, but the French Revolution provided the spark. The old world of aristocratic privilege, the very system that had ostracized him, was violently dismantled. Suddenly, the rules that had held him back were gone. Birthright was replaced by talent, lineage by merit. For a man like Napoleon, possessed of immense intellect, a prodigious memory, and an obsessive work ethic, this was not an age of terror, but an age of unprecedented opportunity. While others saw chaos, he saw a ladder. His early military successes, most notably his brilliant use of artillery at the siege of Toulon in 1793, earned him a promotion to brigadier general at the age of 24. Yet this was merely a prelude. The true test, the moment the world would first witness the full force of his ambition married to his genius, came in 1796. He was handed command of the Army of Italy, an appointment some saw as a strategic sidelining. The army was a basket case. Stationed in Nice, it was a demoralized, starving, and mutinous rabble of 38,000 men. Their uniforms were in tatters, they had not been paid in months, and their purpose had withered. They were a failing enterprise on the verge of liquidation. To the established powers of Europe, whose armies were led by aging dukes and princes maneuvering in accordance with the gentlemanly, predictable rules of 18th century warfare, this French army was a joke. To Napoleon, it was a blank canvas. This was his startup, and he was its visionary CEO. Upon his arrival, he did not simply impose discipline. He unleashed a psychological shockwave. He gathered his broken men, and with the burning intensity that had once isolated him, he sold them a new vision. His first proclamation to the Army of Italy is a masterclass in leadership as performance art. Soldiers, you are naked, ill-fed. The government owes you much. It can give you nothing. Your patience, the courage you display in the midst of these rocks are admirable, but they procure you no glory. No fame is reflected upon you. I seek to lead you into the most fertile plains in the world. Rich provinces, great cities will be in your power. There you will find honor, glory, and riches. Soldiers of Italy, will you be wanting in courage or steadfastness? This was not the address of a typical general. It was the pitch of a founder. He acknowledged their pain. You are naked, ill-fed. Identified a common enemy, a feckless government. Presented a clear, intoxicating vision, the most fertile plains in the world, and laid out the incentives, honor, glory, and riches. He transformed their suffering from a source of misery into a justification for conquest. In that moment, he ceased to be just a commander. He became their champion, the embodiment of their own resentments and hopes. He gave them a purpose beyond survival, greatness. What followed was a campaign that can only be understood as a profound disruption of the industry of war. The Austrian and Sardinian forces opposing him were corporate behemoths, slow, bureaucratic, hierarchical, and utterly predictable. Their generals planned campaigns by the book, moving their armies as single, ponderous units. Napoleon treated these rules with contempt. His strategy was that of a nimble startup, a generation ahead of its competition. He weaponized speed. His famous maxim, "March separately, fight together," was revolutionary. While the Austrians lumbered, Napoleon's divisions, under the command of fiercely loyal and newly promoted marshals like Massena and Augereau, would speed along separate roads, living off the land, converging on the enemy from multiple directions with bewildering speed. This operational tempo shattered his opponent's decision-making cycles. Before an Austrian commander could fully grasp the threat from the south, another French division would appear from the east. It was a strategic blitzkrieg, decades before the term existed. He targeted not just armies, but enemy morale. His proclamations were not only for his troops, they were for his enemies, promising liberation to the Italian people while his cannons promised destruction to their Austrian masters. He understood that war was fought in the mind as much as on the field. And most importantly, his army was a meritocracy. The men he promoted were, like him, products of the revolution, daring, ambitious, and unburdened by the old ways. Their loyalty was to him and the glory he promised, not to a distant king. This created an organization that was agile, adaptable, and fanatically driven. The results were staggering. In a matter of weeks, he shattered the Sardinian army, forcing them to sue for peace. He then turned on the Austrians, driving them back across northern Italy in a series of victories that left the chancelleries of Europe speechless. But it was at a simple wooden bridge spanning the Adda River in the town of Lodi on May 10, 1796, that the campaign, and Napoleon himself, underwent a fundamental transformation. Militarily, the Battle of the Bridge of Lodi was not a major strategic masterpiece. It was a frontal assault, a brutal, high-risk maneuver. The Austrian rearguard had positioned 14 cannons at the far end of the 200-yard-long bridge, ready to obliterate anything that tried to cross. A direct charge seemed suicidal. His more experienced generals advised him to wait, to find another crossing. But Napoleon's mind, buzzing with a string of impossible victories, was operating on a different level. He saw not just a military objective, but a symbolic one. He needed to demonstrate that for his army, for him, nothing was impossible. After a thunderous artillery barrage to shake the Austrian gunners, Napoleon gave the order. The French column surged forward, but the hail of canister shot from the Austrian cannons was devastating, and the charge faltered. The moment hung in the balance. It was then that Napoleon, along with his marshals, physically intervened. He was not directing from a safe distance. He was at the front, urging the men on, his presence a raw, magnetic force. He was seen personally directing the placement of cannons, a task usually left to junior officers, earning him the affectionate nickname Le Petit Caporal, the Little Corporal, from his men. Inspired, the French grenadiers reformed and charged again, this time making it across the bridge in a wave of bayonets and revolutionary fervor. The Austrian line broke. The victory was absolute. But the true victory was not the one won on the bridge. It was the one won inside Napoleon's own mind. He would later reflect on the profound psychological impact of that day with stunning clarity. It was only on the evening of Lodi that I came to believe in myself as a superior man, and that the ambition came to me of executing the great things which had so far been occupying my thoughts only as a fantastic dream. This is the key. Lodi was his moment of supreme self-realization. The Corsican's complex, the desperate need of the outsider to prove he was as good as his peers, was burned away in the flash of Austrian cannons and replaced by something far more potent and dangerous, the Napoleonic complex. It was the conviction that he was not just equal, but superior, that he was not merely a participant in the currents of history, but a man who could bend them to his will. The fantastic dream was now a plausible future. The ambition, once a reactive engine of insecurity, was now a proactive force of destiny. The 1796 Italian campaign was the perfect fusion of man and moment. It took a brilliant, ambitious outsider and placed him at the head of a hungry, meritocratic army, unleashed by revolution against a stagnant and decaying order. He was the disruptive innovator who, through speed, psychological warfare, and a revolutionary organizational culture, achieved a stunning market takeover. At Lodi, his startup had its legendary success story, and its founder now looked at the world not as a market to compete in, but as a map to be redrawn in his own image. The stage was set for the creation of an empire, built by the architect of victory, a man who now believed himself to be an agent of destiny. The fire lit at Lodi burned hot. It forged a new level of ambition in Napoleon, a conviction that he was a man of destiny. But ambition alone does not conquer a continent. The chaotic, inspirational energy of a startup founder can win initial market share, but it cannot sustain an empire. Genius is a finite resource. It cannot be everywhere at once. To achieve his now grandiose aims, Napoleon confronted the timeless challenge of scaling success. How do you transform personal brilliance into a reliable, repeatable, and overwhelming system? The answer was the Grande Armée, the most feared war machine of its age, and its revolutionary design was Napoleon's greatest masterpiece as a strategic architect. If the 1796 Army of Italy was his scrappy startup, the Grande Armée of 1805 was his multinational corporation, meticulously designed for growth and hostile takeovers. Before Napoleon, European armies were largely monolithic beasts. A general commanded a single, vast formation of 50,000 to 70,000 men. It was cumbersome, slow, and brittle. Its command structure was hopelessly centralized. Orders had to trickle down through a complex hierarchy, making rapid adaptation impossible. It could only move as fast as its slowest supply wagon, and could only fight where the entire formation was present. It was, in modern terms, a rigid, vertically integrated monopoly ripe for disruption. Napoleon's solution was the Corps d'Armée, Army Corps system, a design of such elegant logic that it remains the basis for most modern military organization. He broke the monolithic Grande Armée into 5, then 7 self-sufficient combined arms divisions of 20,000 to 40,000 men. Each corps was, in essence, a miniature army. It had its own infantry divisions, its own light cavalry for reconnaissance, its own integrated artillery, and its own staff for engineering and administration. Commanded by one of Napoleon's trusted marshals, his senior vice presidents, a corps could march independently, fight on its own for a significant period, and fully handle its own operational needs without direct oversight from imperial headquarters. The strategic advantages this system conferred were staggering. First, it created unparalleled flexibility and speed. Instead of a single slow-moving column, the Grande Armée could advance on a broad front, an ominous 100-mile-wide net of multiple corps advancing simultaneously. This concealed Napoleon's true intentions and forced the enemy to guess where the main blow would fall. When the moment came, these independent corps could converge with terrifying speed. The march separately, fight together doctrine, to achieve local superiority and crush an enemy force before it knew what was happening. Second, it revolutionized command and control. Napoleon no longer needed to micromanage tens of thousands of men. His strategic task was simplified to its essence. He only had to command his 7 marshals. He was the CEO setting the grand strategy, and his VPs were empowered to execute it. This streamlined the flow of information and dramatically accelerated the OODA loop: observe, orient, decide, act. Napoleon could receive intelligence, make a decision, and have his army executing a complex maneuver on a continental scale, while his opponents were still waiting for reports to reach their headquarters. Finally, it fostered initiative and delegation. The marshals were not mindless automatons. They were ambitious, often brilliant commanders in their own right. The corps system gave them the autonomy to seize opportunities. If a marshal saw a weakness, he had the authority and the resources to exploit it immediately, within the framework of the emperor's broader intent. This created a dynamic and adaptive organization that consistently outthought its more rigid adversaries. This perfectly engineered machine was unleashed upon Europe in the autumn of 1805. The Third Coalition, financed by British gold, had been formed to curb his power. An Austrian army of 72,000 men under the command of General Karl Mack von Leiberich had advanced into Bavaria, taking up a defensive position around the fortress city of Ulm. Mack was a competent, by-the-book general. He expected Napoleon to advance frontally through the traditional invasion route of the Black Forest. He prepared for a battle. What he got instead was a masterclass in strategic strangulation, a victory won not by fighting, but by a flowchart. Napoleon had no intention of playing by the book. While he dispatched Marshal Murat with a large cavalry force to make a noisy, conspicuous demonstration in the Black Forest, a brilliant piece of misdirection that confirmed all of Mack's biases, the true maneuver was already in motion. The 7 corps of the Grande Armée, a torrent of over 200,000 men, were not heading for Ulm's front door. In a colossal wheeling maneuver known as le manœuvre sur le derrière, maneuver on the rear, they swept north of Mack's position, crossed the Danube River far to his east, and descended on his lines of communication. The corps system made this epic scale of maneuver possible. Each corps moved at its own pace on its own road, like the fingers of a great hand closing into a fist. By the time Mack realized he had been duped, it was too late. He was surrounded. The roads to Vienna and safety were cut. His army was trapped in a strategic prison from which there was no escape. On October 20, 1805, a bewildered and humiliated General Mack surrendered his entire army with barely a major battle having been fought. Napoleon had used his organizational system as a weapon, defeating his enemy through superior logistics, speed, and information. It was the bloodless apotheosis of strategic design, a victory of the architect. But if Ulm demonstrated the system's strategic perfection, the Battle of Austerlitz, fought just 6 weeks later on December 2nd, would demonstrate its tactical invincibility. It would become Napoleon's signature masterpiece, the battle he was proudest of, and for good reason. It was the ultimate trap, sprung by an army that could feign weakness while concealing overwhelming strength. Facing a combined Russo-Austrian army of nearly 90,000 men, commanded by their respective emperors, Alexander I and Francis II, Napoleon, with only 67,000, appeared to be in a perilous position. And he played the part beautifully. In the days leading up to the battle, he projected weakness and anxiety. He abandoned the strategically dominant Pratzen Heights, a rolling plateau in the center of the battlefield, and even requested an armistice. The Allied commanders, brimming with confidence, saw a cornered and overextended Napoleon ready to be crushed. Their plan was simple. They would launch a massive assault on Napoleon's seemingly right flank to cut off his line of retreat to Vienna. This was exactly what Napoleon wanted them to think. His apparent weakness was a carefully crafted illusion. As the sun of Austerlitz rose on the morning of the battle, it burned through a thick valley fog, revealing a scene of Napoleon's own making. The bulk of the Allied army was, as he had predicted, descending from the Pratzen Heights to smash into his right flank. They were deliberately weakening their own center to execute this flanking maneuver. Watching from his command post, Napoleon turned to his marshals. "When the enemy is making a false movement," he said, "we must take good care not to interrupt him." He waited until the Allied center on the heights was sufficiently thinned. Then, at the perfect moment, around 9 a.m., he gave the decisive order to Marshal Soult. One sharp blow, and the war is over. Soult's Fourth Corps, which had been concealed in the fog at the base of the plateau, surged forward. In a brutal uphill fight, they stormed the Pratzen Heights, shattering the weakened Allied center and seizing the high ground. The Allied army was instantly split in two, its command structure thrown into chaos. The move was so audacious, so unexpected, that the Allied commanders simply could not react in time. What followed was a systematic annihilation. While Soult held the center, Napoleon pivoted his other corps to destroy the two separated wings of the Allied army. To the north, Marshal Lannes's V Corps and Murat's cavalry crushed the Russian right wing. To the south, the massive Allied flanking force that was supposed to win the battle found itself trapped between French forces in its front and Soult's corps descending from the heights in its rear. The success of this southern fight depended on another marvel of the corps system. To hold that flank against the main Allied attack, Napoleon had relied on Marshal Davout's Third Corps. In one of the most incredible feats of the era, Davout's men had force-marched 70 miles in just 2 days, arriving just in time to absorb the initial blow and pin the Allied left wing in place long enough for the trap to be sprung. It was a testament to the endurance of the French soldier, the leadership of their marshal, and the operational independence granted by the corps design. Austerlitz was not just a victory, it was a symphony of deception, timing, and flawless execution. Every part of the system worked in perfect harmony. The independence of the corps allowed Napoleon to hide his true strength. The leadership of his marshals, Soult and Davout, allowed for both a decisive central thrust and a resilient flank defense. The result was the utter destruction of the Third Coalition's main army. It was a victory so complete, so artistically perfect, that it cemented in Napoleon's mind the infallibility of both his system and himself. In 1805, Napoleon the architect had perfected his machine. The Grande Armée, powered by the corps system, was an instrument of war so superior to its rivals that victory seemed a matter of process. Ulm and Austerlitz were the glorious proofs of concept. But within this perfection lay the seeds of a dangerous psychological flaw. When your system is flawless and you are its sole designer, it becomes easy to conflate the genius of the system with the genius of the self. The man who had once been an insecure outsider, then a brilliant disruptor, was now the undisputed master of Europe. He was no longer just an agent of destiny, he believed he was its author. And an author who believes he cannot write a bad line is destined for a tragic final act. Success is a potent narcotic. After the masterpieces of Ulm and Austerlitz, Napoleon was not merely the master of Europe, he was the master of a reality of his own making. He had designed a system of war so perfect, so dominant, that he began to believe the underlying principles of the world, of nations, of people, of loyalty, could also be redesigned to his specifications. The architect of victory, convinced of his own infallibility, began to lose the ability to read the blueprints of human nature. This psychological decay first metastasized in the sun-scorched plains and rugged mountains of Spain, a conflict he himself would later call his bleeding ulcer. It was a wound that festered not just on the battlefield, but deep within his own mind, sustained by the powerful cognitive poison of confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is the tendency of the human mind to seek out, interpret, and favor information that confirms pre-existing beliefs while actively avoiding or dismissing information that contradicts them. It is the enemy of adaptation. For a commander whose genius rested on accurately perceiving reality and acting upon it with blinding speed, its onset was catastrophic. By 1808, Napoleon's pre-existing belief was simple and absolute. Wars were contests between professional armies won by decisive battle and superior strategy. The will of the common people was a negligible factor, a passive landscape upon which great generals moved their pieces. Spain would prove to be the most brutal contradiction to this belief he would ever face, and his mind was pathologically unprepared to accept it. His first act in Spain was one of pure, unadulterated hubris. Under the guise of invading Britain's ally, Portugal, he moved over 100,000 troops into Spain. Then, in a stunning betrayal, he forced the Spanish king to abdicate and placed his own brother, Joseph Bonaparte, on the throne. To Napoleon's mind, this was a logical, almost benevolent act of system engineering. He was replacing a decadent, incompetent monarchy with his modern, enlightened Napoleonic code. What he failed to compute in his imperial arrogance was the ferocious pride of the Spanish people. He did not see a nation. He saw a backward feudal state in need of his administration. He could not conceive that the people would rise up for their faith and their king against the godless French liberators. And rise up they did. On May 2nd, 1808, the people of Madrid launched a doomed but ferocious uprising against the French garrison. The Dos de Mayo was brutally crushed, but it lit a fire that consumed the entire peninsula. What followed was not a war Napoleon recognized. There were few grand battles to be won. Instead, a new term entered the world's military vocabulary: La Guerra de Guerrillas, the Little War. This was not war as Napoleon understood it. It was a popular insurgency, waged by a phantom army of peasants, priests, and disbanded soldiers. It had no front line and followed no gentlemanly rules. The guerrillas did not seek to defeat the Grande Armée in the field. They sought to bleed it to death. They ambushed small patrols, assassinated French officials, and, most critically, savaged Napoleon's supply lines. A courier with a message required an escort of 200 cavalry. A wagon of grain required a battalion. The mighty corps d'armée, designed for grand sweeping maneuvers, was tactically neutered, forced to disperse its strength into thousands of tiny garrisons and patrols in a hostile countryside. It was like trying to kill a swarm of hornets with a cannon. This new reality sent a flood of contradictory information back to Paris. Napoleon's marshals on the ground, men like Lannes, Soult, and Bessières, sent dispatches detailing the horrific, unconventional nature of the war. They described a population transformed by what one French general called a rabies in the public mind. They reported on the constant draining losses that produced no strategic gain. But this data did not fit Napoleon's mental model. He, in turn, latched on to any information that confirmed his own belief, that these were merely bandits, brigands, and religious fanatics who could be suppressed with sufficient force. He processed every minor victory as proof that the situation was under control, and dismissed the endless reports of ambushes and atrocities as anecdotal noise. His confirmation bias created an echo chamber between his own mind and the dispatches he chose to believe, insulating him from the terrifying truth of the situation. Nowhere was this truth presented more starkly, more apocalyptically, than in the Aragonese city of Zaragoza. When French forces first approached Zaragoza in mid-1808, they expected the poorly defended city to fall in days. They were met with one of the most ferocious displays of civilian resistance in modern history. The first siege was a bloody failure for the French. In the winter of 1809, they returned with a vengeance. Marshals Lannes and Moncey arrived with a powerful army and a massive siege train, determined to make an example of the city. What ensued was not a siege, it was hell on earth. The defense of Zaragoza was led by General José de Palafox, but its true commander was the collective, fanatical will of its people. The city's motto, emblazoned on its shield, was Zaragoza no se rinde. Zaragoza does not surrender. This was no idle boast. The fight became a house-to-house, room-to-room struggle of unparalleled savagery. With the city walls breached, every convent, every church, every home became a fortress. Men, women, and children fought side by side. Priests were killed bearing crucifixes while leading charges. Noble women formed corps to carry ammunition and tend to the wounded, often picking up the muskets of the fallen. The legendary Maid of Aragon, Agustina de Aragon, was said to have single-handedly manned a cannon after its crew was killed. The French, masters of open-field battle, were dragged into a meat grinder. Their only solution was to physically destroy the city block by block. They mined under streets to blow up houses, only to be met by Spanish countermines. The air was thick with the dust of collapsed buildings and the stench of thousands of unburied corpses, which soon brought on an epidemic of typhus that ravaged both sides. Marshal Lannes, a hardened veteran of 100 battles, was aghast. He wrote to Napoleon, "What a war! To have to kill so many brave men, or men so possessed by madness. This victory brings no glory." After 2 months of unspeakable horror, the city, now little more than a pile of rubble filled with 54,000 dead and dying Spaniards, finally capitulated. The French had lost 10,000 of their own. From his distant palace, Napoleon processed the fall of Zaragoza as a victory. It confirmed his belief: apply enough force and the enemy will break. But he fundamentally failed, or refused, to compute the strategic implication. The victory at Zaragoza cost him 10,000 soldiers, irreplaceable veterans, and elite siege engineers to take a single city. There were hundreds of cities and towns in Spain. If even a fraction of them resisted with the fanaticism of Zaragoza, the occupation of Spain was mathematically impossible. The war was unwinnable. Zaragoza was the ultimate piece of disconfirming evidence, a terrifying data point that should have forced a complete strategic reassessment. Instead, filtered through Napoleon's confirmation bias, the lesson he took was that he simply needed to be more forceful. He continued to pour troops into the Spanish quagmire, convinced that one more victory, one more push would break the bandits and pacify the population. He never did. The ulcer continued to bleed, draining his empire of hundreds of thousands of veteran soldiers, vast sums of gold, and, most importantly, the aura of his invincibility. It was in Spain that his enemies, particularly the British under Wellington, learned that the French were not gods, that they could be beaten. Spain was the first place where Napoleon's mind was truly defeated. His inability to adapt his thinking to a new paradigm, his refusal to accept that his model of warfare had become obsolete against a determined popular insurgency, created the festering wound that would dog him to the end. It was a slow, grinding failure of psychology, a warning that his greatest faculty, his mind, was becoming a prison. The cracks in the facade, opened in the dust of Spain, would be ripped wide open in the snows of Russia. If the war in Spain was a slow, festering ulcer, the invasion of Russia in 1812 was a massive, systemic failure of the imperial mind. It was a grand gamble predicated not on strategy, but on a series of profound cognitive errors that cascaded into the single greatest military disaster of the 19th century. Here, the cracks that appeared in Spain became chasms. Napoleon, the architect of a near-perfect system of war, became the victim of his own flawed mental software. The Russian campaign was a psychological Waterloo, where a toxic cocktail of overconfidence, loss aversion, and the sunk cost fallacy led to the annihilation of the Grande Armée and the beginning of his end. The first and most fundamental error was a failure of imagination, born of supreme overconfidence bias. Napoleon was the master of the short, decisive war. His entire system was built for it. He would launch a lightning campaign, force a climactic battle near the enemy's border, annihilate their army, and dictate peace terms from their capital, all within a few months. He planned the Russian invasion with the same mental blueprint. He assembled the largest European army in history, some 600,000 men, and his meticulous logistical planning was a marvel on paper. But it was a plan for the wrong war. This is the planning fallacy in action, the tendency to underestimate the time, costs, and risks of future actions, driven by an optimistic belief in one's own capabilities. He planned for a war that would be over in 9 weeks. He failed to plan for a war against geography itself. He could not conceive that the Russian army would refuse his decisive battle, trading space for time and luring him ever deeper into its vast, inhospitable interior. His supply wagons, designed for the fertile plains of Europe, became mired in the mud of Lithuanian summer storms and bogged down on primitive Russian roads. The summer heat, not the winter cold, delivered the first blow. Disease, typhus, dysentery swept through the ranks, killing tens of thousands before a single major battle was fought. The greatest army in the world was being defeated by microbes and mud, a reality his grand, battle-centric mindset could not process. Yet he pushed on, his confirmation bias seeking the one thing that would validate his entire strategy, the decisive battle. He finally got it on September 7th, before the gates of Moscow at a small village called Borodino. What ensued was the bloodiest single day of the Napoleonic Wars, a horrific, close-quarter slaughter that left nearly 75,000 men killed or wounded. The French pushed the Russians back, but the Russian army did not break. As evening fell, Napoleon's marshals, seeing the exhausted enemy wavering, begged him to commit his final, fresh reserve, the 18,000 men of the Imperial Guard, to deliver the coup de grace. This was the moment the campaign, and perhaps the war, could have been won. Napoleon refused. If there is another battle tomorrow, he reasoned, where is my army? On the surface, it sounds like prudence, but psychologically, it was a profound case of loss aversion. This cognitive bias describes our tendency to feel the pain of a loss more acutely than the pleasure of an equivalent gain. The Imperial Guard was more than just a military unit. It was the ultimate symbol of his power and glory, his most valuable, pristine asset. The thought of risking its destruction, of losing it, became psychologically unbearable. The potential gain of winning the entire war was outweighed by the intense, irrational fear of losing his Praetorians. He had dragged his army 1,000 miles for this one moment, and when it arrived, he could not bring himself to risk his most prized possession. He won the field, but lost the decision, allowing the Russian army to retreat in good order. His prize was Moscow. He entered the ancient capital a week later, expecting a delegation of boyars to surrender the city and plead for peace from their czar. Instead, he was met with an eerie, echoing silence. The city was a ghost town. Its inhabitants fled. Then the fires began. Set by Russian patriots, the Great Fire of Moscow raged for 4 days, destroying the city that was meant to be his army's winter refuge. The trap was now sprung. He was stranded in the heart of a hostile nation, at the end of a collapsing supply line, with a victorious but exhausted army, no shelter, and the infamous Russian winter closing in. A rational leader would have recognized the catastrophic failure and initiated an immediate retreat to save his army. But Napoleon was no longer fully rational. He was now in the grip of the sunk cost fallacy. This is the psychological trap of continuing a failing endeavor because of the amount of resources already invested. He had sacrificed over 100,000 men and immense treasure to get to Moscow. To leave with nothing, no peace treaty, no glory, was to admit a colossal, humiliating failure. His mind could not accept this, and so he waited. For 5 weeks, he lingered in the burnt-out shell of Moscow, sending futile peace feelers to Tsar Alexander, who refused to reply. He was waiting for a payoff that would justify his immense investment, psychologically unable to cut his losses. It is in this period of collective delusion that the story of Sergeant Bourgogne of the Imperial Guard becomes so poignantly illustrative. While their emperor waited for a treaty that would never come, the soldiers, mimicking their leader's disconnect from reality, focused on plunder. Bourgogne meticulously listed his spoils: pounds of sugar and rice, a Chinese silk dress embroidered in gold, silver ornaments, a piece of the cross from the Kremlin, a Russian prince's jewel-encrusted spittoon, and a woman's fur-lined riding cloak he wore over his uniform. This was not the behavior of soldiers preparing for a desperate march for survival. It was the behavior of men who believed they had won. They were laden with silks, silver, and useless treasures while casting aside essentials like excess food, warm blankets, and horseshoes. The entire army, from the emperor in the Kremlin to the private in his looted coat, was acting out a fantasy of victory, psychologically unable to confront the mortal peril they were in. Bourgogne's jeweled spittoon was the perfect metaphor for Napoleon's conquest of Moscow, a glittering, valuable, but utterly useless prize in the face of the approaching apocalypse. The 5 weeks were a fatal delay. The first snows fell on October 13th, a gentle warning that soon became a blizzard. When the retreat finally began, it was too late. The Grande Armée, burdened by its plunder and weakened by hunger, marched straight into the jaws of General Winter. The story of the retreat is a litany of horrors: starvation, frostbite, cannibalism, and constant harassment by Cossacks. It was the utter collapse of a military system and a human society. The Russian campaign was a singular catastrophe, orchestrated by a cascade of cognitive failures. Napoleon's overconfidence led him to plan for a war that didn't exist. His loss aversion prevented him from seizing victory when it was within his grasp, and his commitment to a sunk cost kept him in Moscow until the retreat became an irreversible death sentence. He had built an empire on his ability to see reality more clearly than anyone else. In 1812, he saw only what he wanted to see, and in doing so, he led 500,000 men to their doom. An army is more than a collection of armed men. It is a web of belief. For the soldiers of the Grande Armée, this belief was centered on one man. It was an unspoken, almost sacred contract. They would give Napoleon their endurance, their courage, their very lives, and in return, he would give them victory. He would lead them through impossible hardship to certain glory. This psychological contract, forged in the revolutionary fires of Italy and sanctified under the sun of Austerlitz, was the true source of their strength. In the frozen wastes of Russia, that contract was broken, and the army's soul died long before its body. To understand this, one must see the retreat not from the emperor's headquarters, but through the eyes of the men who paid the price for his hubris. Let us call him Jean-Luc, a veteran of the line, a man whose back still bore the scars from the fighting at Austerlitz. He was not a marshal, just a man who had learned to trust the searing logic of the emperor's plans. As they marched out of a smoldering Moscow in mid-October, Jean-Luc felt a familiar unease, but his faith held. The emperor had a plan. He always had a plan. Yet the veteran's eye saw things that troubled him. The column stretched for miles, choked not with extra ammunition or fodder, but with a garish train of plunder. Wagons groaned under the weight of silver candelabras, fine furniture, and silk tapestries. Men pushed carts filled with useless, glittering treasures. Jean-Luc, clutching his musket and his small sack of flour, knew the simple, brutal calculus of a campaign. This was not the baggage of a disciplined army preparing for a hard march. It was the delusion of victors on parade. It was the first sign that the command's perception of reality had dangerously diverged from his own. The first snows fell not with fury, but with a deceptive, silent softness. Within days, the softness became a blinding, endless blizzard. The temperature plunged. The first to die, in their tens of thousands, were the horses. They were the engines of the army, the providers of mobility for cavalry and cannons, transporters of what little food remained. Jean-Luc watched them fall, their legs buckling, their breath turning to ice. And with their death, the Grande Armée ceased to be an army. It became a shambling, disorganized column of men walking into a white desert. The cannons were abandoned in the snowdrifts. The cavalry became infantry. The loot-filled wagons were set ablaze. The treasured silks and candelabras now just fuel for a few moments of pathetic warmth. It was here that the psychological contract began to unravel with terrifying speed. The promise of glory was a distant, mocking echo. The only reality was the gnawing in the belly and the bite of the wind. Discipline, the bedrock of any army, evaporated. Jean-Luc saw a group of men from his own company, men with whom he had shared wine and stories, fall upon a collapsed horse with knives, hacking at its flesh while it was still alive. An hour later, he saw 2 of those same men shot by their comrades over a disputed piece of the raw, bloody meat. This was the new currency. Not honor, not bravery, but a mouthful of horseflesh mixed with gunpowder from a dirty pouch. His faith in the emperor, once a source of strength, became a source of profound, corrosive bitterness. Jean-Luc remembered the proclamations from Italy, the promises of rich plains and great cities. What was that promise now? He had been led here, to this frozen hell, for what? For a burnt city? For a czar who refused to speak? The sunk-cost fallacy that kept Napoleon in Moscow for 5 fatal weeks had a different name on the ground: a pointless, agonizing death march. The soldiers were not fools. They knew they had been squandered. They could feel the purposelessness of their suffering in their frozen bones. They had been gambled away by a leader who could not admit he had lost. And so the army turned on itself. The concepts of regiment, of company, of brotherhood dissolved. There was only one unit now: the marcheur, the walker, and the non-marcheur. Those who fell were stripped of their clothes and boots, often before they had breathed their last. Jean-Luc learned to sleep while walking, stumbling forward with his musket held tight, trusting no one. He learned to fear the sight of his own comrades, their eyes hollowed out not just by hunger, but by a terrifying nihilism. Circling this column of ghosts were the Cossacks. They never engaged in a real battle. They were wraiths with lances, appearing from the swirling snow to spear the stragglers, to cut down the foraging parties, to remind the dying army that there was no escape. They were the scavengers of the apocalypse, feeding on the carcass of the Grande Armée. The ultimate horror, the final convulsive death rattle of the army, came in late November at the Berezina River. It was not yet frozen solid enough to walk across, but filled with a slurry of treacherous ice flows. Russian armies were closing in on both banks. The only hope was to cross 2 makeshift bridges, thrown up with heroic speed by the army's Dutch engineers, who worked in the freezing water until most of them died. What happened at the bridges was not a military crossing. It was a human stampede. Jean-Luc was caught in the torrent of panic. He saw wagons and cannons tumble into the icy water, taking men and women with them. He saw soldiers use their bayonets not on the Russians, but on their own comrades to fight for a place on the bridge. The Russian artillery opened fire, the cannonballs smashing into the dense crowds, turning order into a blood-soaked, screaming chaos. Tens of thousands were lost, drowned, crushed, or cut down by the Russians who now closed the trap. Jean-Luc made it across. How, he never knew. He simply pushed forward, a single automaton of survival. No longer a soldier, no longer a citizen, just a thing that refused to die. When the last remnants of the army finally stumbled across the Niemen River and out of Russia in mid-December, the spell was broken forever. Jean-Luc was a ghost in a tattered uniform. He had left Moscow as a soldier of the greatest army on earth. He returned as a survivor of a frozen nightmare. Of the 500,000 who had marched in with confidence and pride, only a few thousand skeletal figures remained to tell the tale. The Grande Armée had not just been defeated, it had been erased. It died from the cold, from starvation, and from the guns of the Russians. But its soul had perished from something far colder: the realization that the sacred contract had been a lie. Their leader, the man-god in whom they had placed their absolute faith, had led them to ruin not for a great purpose, but because he was captive to the flaws in his own mind. The magic was gone, and only the human cost remained. For nearly a decade, the nations of Europe had faced the problem of Napoleon. They had thrown armies, coalitions, and empires at him, only to see them shattered by his unparalleled tactical genius. He operated on a different intellectual plane, his mind moving faster, his vision clearer than any of his rivals. To fight Napoleon was to play a game where he had already calculated every possible move. After the Russian disaster, however, something fundamental shifted. The myth of his invincibility was broken, but more importantly, his enemies, for the first time, began to understand the nature of the game they were playing. During a quiet summer armistice in 1813, in a castle in Silesia, they devised a new set of rules. The strategy they formalized, the Trachenberg Plan, was a masterpiece of psychological warfare, a plan designed not to outfight Napoleon, but to outthink him by turning his own genius against itself. The destruction of the Grande Armée in Russia should have been the end. But in a feat of administrative and organizational brilliance, Napoleon performed a miracle in early 1813. He raised a new army of nearly 500,000 men. It was a phantom force, however, built around young, raw conscripts, the Marie-Louises, named for his empress, and, critically, it lacked the veteran non-commissioned officers and experienced cavalry that had been the backbone of his previous armies. This new army could fight, but it was a brittle instrument. He led this army into Germany and, in the spring of 1813, scored 2 hard-fought victories at Lutzen and Bautzen. Yet these were not the thunderclap triumphs of old. The Russo-Prussian forces, though defeated, were not destroyed. They retreated in good order, their morale intact. The old magic seemed to be flickering. Napoleon, lacking the cavalry to pursue and annihilate his foes, could not land a decisive blow. A summer armistice was called, giving both sides a chance to regroup. It was during this fateful pause that the Sixth Coalition was truly born, as Austria, finally abandoning its alliance with France, joined Russia, Prussia, Sweden, and Great Britain. It was also during this pause that the Allied leadership gathered to solve the Napoleonic problem. In attendance were Tsar Alexander I, King Frederick William III of Prussia, and 2 figures who understood Napoleon's system intimately: Jean-Victor Moreau, a rival French general exiled to America, and, perhaps most importantly, Jean-Baptiste Bernadotte, now Crown Prince of Sweden, who had once been one of Napoleon's own marshals. They understood his strengths, but more importantly, they now understood his psychology. They knew his towering ego, his insatiable craving for a single, glorious, war-ending battle where his personal genius could shine. And they decided, in a stroke of collective genius, to deny him it. The Trachenberg Plan was revolutionary in its simplicity and its inversion of military doctrine. For centuries, the primary goal of warfare was to seek out and destroy the enemy's main army. The Trachenberg Plan dictated the exact opposite. Its core tenets were: 1. Create 3 independent multinational armies: the Army of the North under Bernadotte, the Army of Silesia under the fiery Prussian Gebhard von Blücher, and the main Army of Bohemia under the cautious Austrian Prince Schwarzenberg. 2. All 3 armies would advance simultaneously against Napoleon. 3. If any single army encountered Napoleon himself, it was to immediately avoid battle and retreat. 4. Whichever army Napoleon was not facing was to immediately attack the French forces in its sector, which would inevitably be commanded by one of his subordinate marshals. This was not merely a military strategy. It was a psychological trap. It was designed to neutralize Napoleon's greatest strength, his personal command in a decisive battle, and exploit his greatest weakness, the inconsistent quality of his marshals. The Allies acknowledged his genius was unbeatable, so they simply refused to play his game. They would fight a war of attrition, not a war of glory. they would attack the limbs of his empire, bleeding his new fragile army dry and boosting their own morale with victories over his lieutenants, until the head was too weak and isolated to fight back. When the armistice ended in August 1813, the plan went into immediate, devastating effect. Napoleon, seeking the climactic battle he craved, marched on Blücher's army of Silesia. As per the plan, Blücher immediately retreated. At the same time, Prince Schwarzenberg's army advanced on Dresden. Napoleon was forced to race back to Dresden, where he won a significant tactical victory. But while he was engaged there, the logic of the plan unfolded elsewhere. Marshal Oudinot, advancing on Berlin, was defeated by Bernadotte's army at Grossbeeren. Days later, Marshal Macdonald was routed at the Battle of the Katzbach by Blücher, who had advanced again the moment Napoleon had turned away. The effect was maddening for the emperor. He was a strategic firefighter, rushing across Germany from one crisis to the next, only to find the enemy vanishing before him while another fire erupted behind him. His marshals, deprived of his direct oversight, were being systematically dismantled. His young army was being worn down by constant fruitless marching and peripheral defeats. He was the most brilliant boxer in the world, but his opponents had conspired to never step into the main ring with him, choosing instead to land 1,000 body blows in the corridors outside. His ego was denied its glorious stage, and his army was being bled white. The inevitable climax of this strategy arrived in October 1813. Having weakened and cornered their prey, the three great Allied armies, totaling a massive 380,000 men and over 1,500 cannons, finally converged on Napoleon and his 190,000 men near the city of Leipzig. This was to be the Völkerschlacht, the Battle of the Nations, and for the first time, Napoleon was forced to fight a battle not of his own choosing. He was trapped, with his back to a river, facing a foe that outnumbered him 2-1. His tactical genius, however brilliant, could not overcome the catastrophic strategic situation. The battle was a 3-day ordeal of unparalleled scale and ferocity. It was not a battle of elegant maneuver, but a brutal, grinding slugfest that played directly to the Allies' advantage in numbers. Napoleon's raw recruits fought with desperate courage, but they were inexorably pushed back. On the second day, in a moment of profound symbolism, his Saxon allies, seeing the tide had turned, defected to the coalition in the middle of the battle, turning their guns on their former comrades. It was a sign that his political empire was collapsing just as surely as his military position. By the third day, the situation was hopeless. Napoleon ordered a retreat through the city and over the single bridge that crossed the Elster River. In the chaos, a panicked sapper blew the bridge too early, trapping 30,000 of Napoleon's soldiers, his entire rear guard, in the city. What was left of his army was shattered. The defeat was absolute. The Battle of Leipzig cost him over 70,000 casualties and what was left of his German allies. It was the single most decisive defeat of his career. The Trochenberg plan had worked to perfection. It was a strategy born of humility and collaboration, a direct antidote to Napoleon's singular, egocentric style of command. The Allies had learned that you could not defeat Napoleon by trying to be a better version of him. You had to change the rules entirely. By refusing him the glorious, decisive battle he craved and systematically destroying his subordinates, they attacked his system and exploited his psychology. Leipzig was the culmination of this logic, a battle won not by a stroke of genius, but by the relentless, grinding application of a superior strategy. The inversion was complete. The man who had once dictated the terms of every conflict in Europe had finally been forced to fight on terms other than his own. His empire in Germany was gone, and the road back to France was now the road to ruin. Driven back into France in 1814, a cornered Napoleon gave his enemies one last terrifying reminder of the genius they sought to extinguish. With a dwindling army of teenagers and old men, he waged a defensive campaign of such speed, ferocity, and brilliance that he shattered advancing coalition armies one by one. For a fleeting moment, the ghost of 1796 seemed to live again, but it was only a flicker. The enemy was too numerous, France was exhausted, and his own marshals, the men he had raised from obscurity, had finally had enough. They confronted him at Fontainebleau, not as traitors, but as realists, forcing him to face the truth his mind could no longer deny. The war was lost. On April 6, 1814, Napoleon Bonaparte, Emperor of the French, abdicated the throne he had built with blood and brilliance. His exile to the tiny island of Elba was meant to be the end of the story. It was here, stripped of his empire, that he had the time for reflection. He could have asked the vital questions. Why did I fail? What were the flaws in my own judgment that led me here? But the historical record shows this introspection never occurred. He paced the shores of his miniature kingdom, blaming the Russian winter, the incompetence of his marshals, the betrayal of his allies, everyone but himself. He never grasped that his ruin was not a failure of logistics or manpower, but a failure of psychology. He could not see that the same overconfidence that won him Austerlitz doomed him in Russia, or that the stubbornness that took him across the bridge at Lodi devolved into the sunk cost fallacy that trapped him in Moscow. His final, fatal cognitive bias was his inability to recognize any of the others. And so, we are left with his shadow, a legacy as complex and contradictory as the man himself. The dark side of that legacy is a scar across the face of Europe. It is measured in the millions of dead soldiers and civilians, from the fields of Spain to the frozen plains of Russia. It is the story of an ambition so vast and unchecked that it plunged a continent into total war for over a decade. This is the direct consequence of the psychological flaws we have dissected, the confirmation bias that blinded him to the will of the Spanish people, the loss aversion that paralyzed him at Borodino, the hubris that convinced him he could bend the world to his will. This is the monumental human cost of a singular genius left untempered by humility. Yet there is another side to the legacy, one that endures not in casualty figures, but in the very structure of modern society. This is the legacy of the architect. The Napoleonic Code, his great civil law reform, was a revolutionary work of logic and clarity. It swept away a confusing web of feudal laws, enshrining principles of legal equality, property rights, and individual liberty. It was so profoundly rational that it remains the basis of law not only in France, but in dozens of countries around the world. His administrative reforms, the establishment of a centralized bank, universities, and a professional bureaucracy, created the blueprint for the modern, efficient nation-state. This was the product of his other mind, the cool, systematic, and brilliant organizer. Herein lies the ultimate lesson of Napoleon's rise and fall. His story is the timeless, cautionary tale of the duality of genius. The very traits that drove his ascent were the architects of his ruin. The relentless ambition that propelled him from Corsica became the hubris that led him to Moscow. The supreme self-confidence that inspired his soldiers metastasized into an inability to accept contradictory evidence. The mind that could design a system as brilliant as the corps d'armée was the same mind that could not psychologically adapt when that system failed. His light and his shadow were born of the same source. He was the enlightened reformer who plunged Europe into darkness, the rational lawgiver who waged irrational wars. He proved that a single individual of extraordinary talent can indeed change the world, but that without self-awareness and a profound sense of one's own fallibility, the power to create is inseparable from the power to destroy. History does not remember a simple conqueror. It remembers a complex force of nature, an emperor whose story serves as an eternal warning about the heights a man can reach and the spectacular, self-inflicted wounds from which he can fall.